I can still remember that morning as vividly as if it just happened, the way the pale dawn light filtered through the frosted break room window, the bitter smell of burnt office coffee lingering in the air, and that voice, cold and unfamiliar, calling out from behind me, "Russell, in my office, now." There was no greeting, not even a glance of acknowledgement. I turned around and saw the face I had never fully trusted: Derek Vaughn, the newly appointed CEO of Halden Gray, the company I had poured nearly 2 decades of my life and health into building. Derek was the founder's son, and from the hallway whispers I'd caught over the years, he was better at inheriting than actually leading. I thought perhaps it was about the German trade deal I'd been preparing for 6 months, or maybe the performance review I had emailed reminders about twice. But when I stepped into his office, all I received were 3 flat words: "You're being terminated." I froze, not from shock, but from sheer, breathless disbelief. Just 3 weeks earlier, I had returned from prostate cancer surgery, a battle I had kept quiet for nearly a year to protect both my image and my team's momentum. The stitches hadn't fully healed. The pain still crept in like a tide each night. And yet, here I was, discarded like worn-out equipment, as if my years of loyalty and sacrifice expired with my diagnosis. But what Derek didn't know was that his impulsive decision had set off a chain of events he wouldn't be able to contain. And though I walked out of that building with a box of files and not a single word of protest, something within me had ignited not rage, but the quiet, steady will to reclaim the value they had so quickly tried to erase. For nearly 19 years, Halden Gray wasn't just the place I worked, it was the place I bled for, quite literally at times. I had joined the company back when it was little more than a second-hand conference table and 3 mismatched chairs in a rented downtown office in Columbus, Ohio. Back then, it wasn't about stock options or prestige. It was about building something that mattered, something we could believe in. I was there when we landed our first 6-figure client, when our servers crashed mid-presentation in the middle of a rainstorm, and when we celebrated hitting our first $1 million quarter by splitting a single bottle of mid-shelf champagne. I wasn't hired to do what I did, I created it. I built the client engagement division from nothing but phone calls, long nights, and a Rolodex filled by hand. I mentored junior staff who didn't know how to read a contract, walked them through renegotiations, and stayed late reviewing every dotted line because if something went wrong, it would fall on me. I gave weekends, holidays, anniversaries, and more birthdays than I cared to admit to deadlines and disaster control. My wife used to joke that the only time I missed a call was during my own father's funeral, and she wasn't wrong. But even all of that didn't feel like sacrifice at the time. It felt like duty, like purpose. Even during my treatment, when the doctor confirmed what I feared, that the dull ache in my back wasn't just age catching up, but something far worse, I still logged in remotely from a recovery bed with an IV in one arm and my laptop balanced on a pillow. I didn't tell anyone at work, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew how it would look. Aging employee, out of touch, medically compromised, easy to replace, disposable. That's the part no one prepares you for, not the illness itself, but the slow erosion of identity that follows. When the calls stopped coming, when younger voices began leading the calls I once organized, when my opinions were nodded at but never acted upon, you start to notice the subtle shifts. How people stop asking you for input, how your name is left off the meeting invites, how you're left to quietly fade into the backdrop, like old wallpaper in a conference room nobody uses anymore. By the time Derek took over, I had already sensed the shift in wind. He didn't even know what I did, not really. To him, I was just part of the legacy of fixture, not a function. And in the world he envisioned, fixtures didn't have a future. They were replaced, remodeled, or tossed out altogether. The irony, of course, is that in those final weeks before he fired me, I was wrapping up what would have been Halden, Gray's largest international contract to date, a strategic agreement with a European logistics firm that required months of back and forth, cultural alignment, and multilingual coordination that no one else on our team had the background to manage. I had studied the German market late into the night, written tailored proposal decks, and even called in favors from former clients who had since become industry players. That deal wasn't just about numbers, it was about trust, and I had earned it the hard way. But to Derek, none of it mattered. I wasn't flashy. I didn't have a trending MBA or a list of LinkedIn followers. I wasn't new blood. I was the tired body they thought had already given all it could. And maybe, just maybe, That's why he thought he could erase me so easily. But what he didn't realize, what people like him never realize, is that loyalty leaves a paper trail. And mine was printed, signed, and filed across nearly 2 decades of irreplaceable experience. What they tried to bury wasn't just a man with a few gray hairs and a medical file, it was the one person holding the foundation of their future in both hands. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind, already raw from the sting of dismissal, kept circling one detail I couldn't shake: the timing. Just 2 days before, I'd finalized the last-minute logistics for our Friday presentation to Reinbrucker Group, a cross-border contract that had the potential to change the trajectory of Halden Gray for the next 5 years. I had been the primary architect of that relationship since day one, from the first awkward Zoom call with their Munich office to the dinners in Boston where we carefully translated cultural gaps into commercial trust. The meeting had been booked for 11 a.m. sharp on Friday, in our executive boardroom. The Reinbrucker team was flying in for it, but now I was gone. And if Derek hadn't looked into the specifics, if he had simply assumed that any mid-level replacement could step in and run point, then he hadn't just fired a man recovering from cancer. He had sabotaged the entire negotiation before it began. I didn't have to wait long for confirmation. At exactly 9:06 the following morning, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it ring twice, unsure whether I had the stomach to answer anything work-related again, but curiosity won. I picked up, and when I heard the voice on the other end, I froze mid-breath. Russell, it's Martin Keller. Martin Keller, the founder, the original CEO. The man who had personally interviewed me in 2005 and shook my hand with the kind of grip that made you believe in long-term trust. I just walked into the office, he said, and there was an unmistakable edge in his tone, controlled but tight. Why the hell aren't you here? There was a pause on my end, not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I didn't know how much to say. Finally, I said it plainly. Your son let me go yesterday, said I was lazy, said I was no longer needed. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy and taut. Then I heard what sounded like rustling paper, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Jesus Christ, he muttered. Russell, did he read your contract? That question caught me off guard. What are you talking about? The Reinbrucker deal, he said quickly. You're the only authorized signatory on that agreement, aren't you? I blinked. Yes. You insisted on that clause after the Draxon acquisition fell apart. I'm the sole negotiator. No one else can close that deal. Another pause. Longer this time. Then came the sound of something heavy slamming onto a desk, followed by a low, muttered curse. He didn't read the contract, Martin said, more to himself than to me. He just fired the one person the Germans actually trust to finish this deal. In that moment, the sting of humiliation I'd carried since being dismissed shifted into something altogether different. It wasn't pride. It wasn't satisfaction. It was clarity, cold, sober, unshakable clarity. Derek hadn't just underestimated me. He jeopardized the future of the company for no better reason than arrogance and inexperience. He had no idea what he'd done. Martin didn't need to say anything else. I could hear it in the silence that followed, that weight of regret, the dawning realization that his son's first major act as CEO wasn't bold or strategic, but reckless and deeply costly. When the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed, still in the clothes I'd fallen asleep in, staring into the distance as the morning sun crept through the blinds. My coffee sat untouched on the nightstand, already cold. The absurdity of it all made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so stunningly predictable. Derek had walked into a position he hadn't earned, fired someone he didn't understand, and in doing so, had set fire to a bridge he didn't even know existed. And yet, even then, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still, like the tide had gone out and revealed what had been lurking under the surface all along. The next wave was coming. I could sense it. I didn't know whether I'd be swept back into the storm or if I'd simply stand on shore and watch the damage unfold from a safe distance. But what I did know, what I could finally feel in my bones, was that the power had shifted, and this time it wasn't in his hands. The call started at 10:13 a.m., first from Derek himself, then from reception, followed by legal, then accounting. My phone lit up like a pinball machine on tilt, buzzing with frantic energy, each call more desperate than the last. I didn't answer any of them. I sat on my living room couch, still in the same clothes from the day before, staring blankly at the wall, while the city outside my window moved as if nothing had happened. I sipped cold coffee and let the chaos unfold without me. Eventually, one voicemail stood out from the others. It was Derek. His voice, usually soaked in smug assurance, now carried a jittery undertone he probably thought sounded composed. Russell, hey, there was a misunderstanding yesterday. I may have acted a bit too quickly. We really need you back today. It's urgent. Urgent. That word rolled in my mind like loose change in a dry restless, hollow and noisy. He hadn't said he was sorry. Not in corporate speak. Not in plain English. Not even through gritted teeth. What he had said was that he needed me. Not because he'd had a change of heart, but because he was standing on a ledge and realized the bridge he blew up was the only one that led to safety. Still, I didn't move. Not yet. At 10:32, I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Nicole, a former team lead in marketing who used to share the office next to mine back when collaboration still meant something. I answered her call without hesitation. Russell, she whispered, as if the walls around her had ears. You won't believe what's happening here. Try me, I said. Martin just walked into the boardroom, slammed the Reinbrooker contract on the table. Then he looked straight at Derek in front of everyone and asked, Did you read this before you fired Russell? Her voice quivered somewhere between awe and disbelief. Derek tried to bluff, talked about new directions and restructuring, but Martin wasn't having it. He flipped to the clause, the one you always talked about, the one that names you as the sole negotiator. I sat quietly as she described the moment. I imagined the room falling into silence, imagined Derek's face shifting from pale arrogance to the color of raw panic. Then came Nicole's final whisper. Martin told him if this deal falls through because of his decision, his position as CEO becomes negotiable. That was the crack in Derek's armor, the beginning of the unraveling. And for the first time in days, I exhaled slowly, steadily like someone who had been underwater and finally broke the surface. I didn't need vengeance. I didn't want applause. What I wanted was to be seen for the value I had always brought, not just when it was convenient, and certainly not when someone else's mistake made it suddenly relevant. At 11:15, another message arrived, this time from Martin himself. It was short but carried weight. Russell, I'm sincerely sorry for what happened. Please come in not just for the deal, but so we can talk privately. It was tempting, but I'd been burned enough times to know that walking back in with nothing but a handshake and a promise would be nothing more than pageantry. This wasn't about saving face or salvaging a deal. This was about setting terms. If I was going to return, it wouldn't be as a favorite, would be as a professional whose dignity was not up for negotiation. So, I drafted my reply, carefully and without anger. I'm willing to consider returning to finalize the Reinbrooker deal, but only under specific conditions. I'd like to speak with you directly, and I expect written assurances of full autonomy during the negotiation. I won't work under Derek's supervision. That is non-negotiable. I hit send, then stood up and changed out of my rumpled clothes. As I knotted my tie and laced my shoes, I didn't feel like a man crawling back to a former employer. I felt like someone reclaiming the space he had carved out with years of sweat, sacrifice, and silent resilience. When I arrived at the building just after noon, I didn't slip in through the back entrance or sneak past reception. I walked through the front doors like a guest of honor, aware of the heads turning and the hush falling over conversations as I passed. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I didn't need to. The receptionist stood the moment she saw me. Mr. Ellis Martin is expecting you. As she led me down the hall, the hum of whispers rose behind us like a current. It didn't shake me. Not anymore. What mattered now wasn't how many people were watching it, was how I chose to walk through the fire and what I would demand once the smoke cleared. And I wasn't walking in for closure. I was walking in for correction. If I had thought Derek's silence after the Reinbrooker deal was a sign of retreat, I was mistaken. The moment the handshake was sealed and the documents were signed, making the headlines of more than one trade journal the following week, I could feel the mood within Halden Gray begin to shift. Not in an obvious way, of course. Derek was too practiced in the subtleties of corporate warfare to throw tantrums or make overt moves. No, the danger didn't come in explosions. It came in pinpricklet precise, and cumulative. It started small. Reimbursements I had submitted for my travel to the negotiation site, receipts that were always processed within days, began to linger in the system without explanation. I followed up twice, both times receiving vague replies about a backlog in approvals. Then came the unsigned internal memos. Contracts I had reviewed and cleared were returned to my desk without a single edit, but marked incomplete by someone in legal who suddenly couldn't recall who'd made the decision. At first, I thought it was incompetence, but after years in the game, you learn to tell the difference between bureaucracy and sabotage. Then, one afternoon, I received a message that made my stomach tighten. An overseas clientele of our closest strategic partners forwarded me an email allegedly sent from my address. It contained incorrect figures, misrepresented terms, and language that sounded nothing like me. Worse yet, it had already been circulated among their leadership team. I called immediately, and by the grace of the rapport I had spent years building, the client listened, believed me, and agreed to pause further action. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. I reported the breach to our systems team. They conducted a preliminary sweep and came back with a chilling finding. The email had been sent internally, using my credentials, from a shared workstation near the break room. There was no sign of external hacking. Someone inside had gained access. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That's when I knew Derek wasn't finished. He couldn't fire me again. At least not directly, not after what had just happened with Reinbrooker and the board, but that didn't mean he couldn't try to erode my credibility little by little until I either lost the trust of those around me or walked away out of sheer exhaustion. It was a slow assassination, not of my position, but of my name. I started documenting everything, every delay, every misfiled form, every version of every document I submitted. I created digital copies with timestamps, saved backups on encrypted drives, and kept a private notebook in my drawer where I logged conversations, emails, even the inflections of suspicious glances across the table during meetings. I didn't write it out of paranoia. I wrote it out of experience. Because I'd seen this game before when I was 26, barely 2 years out of grad school, working under a director who smiled to your face while cutting you off from every meaningful project behind the scenes, the tactics hadn't changed. Only the faces had. And then, late one evening, I walked past one of the smaller conference rooms and heard Derek's voice, sharp and just a little too loud for comfort. "She's unstable," he said, clearly talking about me. "Since she came back, she's been erratic, confrontational. I don't think she's capable of managing high-pressure accounts anymore." My steps froze. The anger didn't rise in me all at once. Instead, it settled like ice, calm and clear. He continued, undeterred. "We need to start succession planning and client strategy. She's not going to last much longer. Her health's been questionable for months." A second voice replied, someone newer, maybe someone still unsure where their loyalties lay. "But she just saved the Reinbrooker deal under immense pressure," Derek scoffed. "She got lucky. That's not a strategy." I didn't stay to hear more. I didn't need to. I'd heard enough to confirm that I wasn't imagining things, that this wasn't just stress or miscommunication. It was deliberate, calculated, cold. That night, I stayed long after the office emptied. The city outside the window pulsed with indifferent neon, while inside I sat in a darkened meeting room, my reflection staring back from the glass wall across from me. I wasn't shaken. I wasn't afraid. But I was tired of having to prove what should have been obvious. That I belonged here. That I had earned my place not through charm or legacy, but through endurance, through fire, through years of showing up when no one else did. And that's when Martin Keller walked in. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. "You're still here," he said, placing a folder gently on the table. "I could say the same," I replied. Inside the folder was my revised contract, everything we had discussed. Full autonomy, protection from internal interference, a clear statement of responsibilities. I scanned the language. It was solid. "I've also launched an internal audit," he said. "Too many things have been slipping through the cracks. I don't believe in coincidence." I looked up sharply, meeting his eyes. "I'm not blind, Russell," he added. "I know Derek isn't done, and now so do you." "Then why haven't you stopped him?" I asked, voice quiet but steady. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone carried more weariness than authority. Because I needed to know how far he'd go. The room fell silent again. I'm not asking you to protect me, I said, but I am asking you to decide what kind of legacy you want to leave. He didn't argue. He didn't make promises. He simply nodded, slow and thoughtful, then walked out of the room. I remained seated, knowing full well that what came next wouldn't be a battle of shouting matches or boardroom showdown sit, would be something quieter, more dangerous. A war of silence, sabotage, and survival. But this time, I was ready for it. The atmosphere in the office that week grew heavier by the day. People had started whispering when I walked past, and though some greeted me with forced smiles, others averted their eyes entirely as if my presence reminded them of something they'd rather not confront. The internal audit that Martin initiated was no longer a rumor. It had taken shape with speed and discretion, and it rattled the bones of a company long comfortable in its shadows. When the summons came on Thursday morning, I wasn't surprised. A formal invitation from the audit committee to appear for a closed session review in what used to be a storage room, now converted into their war room. A space that smelled of old dust and fresh urgency, filled with binders, laptops, and timelines scrawled across whiteboards in red and black marker. It was the kind of setting where reputations were either restored or quietly erased. David, the lead auditor, greeted me with a firm nod, his expression professional but not unkind. "Thanks for coming in, Russell," he said, gesturing toward a seat across from his terminal. "We'd like to go over a few findings with you." I sat, bracing for whatever was next, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve that had hardened into habit. He opened a file and brought up an email on the screen. I recognized it immediately. The one the overseas partner had flagged, the one someone had sent in my name. "We've traced this message to a shared workstation near the break room," David explained. "Credentials were entered manually. Whoever did it had your login, but not your device or authentication pattern." I didn't react. I had expected as much. "We also found a pattern," he continued, pulling up more file emails that had been rewritten, spreadsheets that had been altered after approval, and document trails that vanished mysteriously between submission and sign-off. The majority of these changes trace back to either shared workstations or, in several cases, logins originating from the executive support account tied to Derek Vaughn's office. That name hung in the air like smoke. "We're not here to assign guilt prematurely," David said, though his tone hinted that the conclusion was no longer in doubt. "But the evidence strongly suggests coordinated sabotage, targeted specifically at your output and possibly your role." I nodded, slowly, the confirmation landing with less shock than it might have weeks ago. "So what happens now?" David leaned back slightly. "Mr. Keller has asked that all findings be presented directly to him. No filters, no delay." "Then I'll be there," I said, my voice low but steady. "You're not required to." I didn't come this far to be briefed secondhand. He didn't argue. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind wasn't racing with panic, but with memory faces of good people who had quietly left Halden Gray in recent years, without so much as a farewell coffee or exit memo. Talented professionals in their prime who vanished one after the other. At the time, I assumed it was burnout, industry churn, or better offers elsewhere. Now, I wondered how many had been edged out, slowly, insidiously, in the same way Derek had been trying with me. I arrived early the next morning, long before the meeting was set to begin. Martin was already there, staring out the window, arms crossed behind his back like a man weighing more than numbers. When the auditors entered, they carried binders thick with printouts and digital logs. Derek arrived 10 minutes late, dressed sharp and walking like someone who still believed charm could rewrite truth. That belief didn't last long. The moment he stepped through the door and saw me seated at the table, his confident gait faltered. "She's not part of the audit committee," he muttered. Martin didn't even turn. "She's here at my request. This is supposed to be internal, confidential." "Then perhaps you should have kept your activities that way," I said, my voice even, my eyes steady. "Before using company systems to falsify emails under my name," Derek scoffed, but the strain behind it showed. "This is ridiculous." "She's bitter about being let go," David interrupted calmly. "The login data is clear. We traced multiple irregularities to your executive assistant's credentials patterns that align precisely with each instance of tampering affecting Mr. Ellis's work. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a series of deliberate actions." Derek's expression flickered, the polished mask beginning to slip. "You're overreaching." No, I said. You are. For a long moment, silence filled the room thick and charged, like the breath before a thunderclap. Martin finally turned to face him. I gave you a chance, Derek. More than one. And all you've done is erode the foundation of what we've built here. Derek opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time since he stepped into power, he looked unsure, like he could see the edge of the cliff too late to stop. The board will be reviewing the full report, Martin continued. Effective immediately. You're suspended pending final determination. The room didn't explode. It didn't need to. Derek stood in silence, glanced at me with a look that wasn't anger, but disbelief-like. He couldn't fathom how his playbook had failed him. And then, without another word, he walked out. Martin exhaled, a weight visible in his shoulders as he sank slightly into the chair beside me. I failed him, he said quietly. As a leader, maybe even as a father. You can't lead someone who refuses to grow, I replied. But you can still lead this company. He looked at me, then really looked, and nodded. For the first time since this began, I felt the air shift, the tension break, not in triumph, but in quiet relief. Not because I had won, but because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. And now, for once, it would be heard. 2 weeks passed after the audit meeting, yet the aftershocks continued to ripple through every corridor and whispered conversation inside Halden Gray. Derek never returned, not to his corner office, not to the executive floor, not even to collect his belongings. His departure wasn't announced with ceremony or email. It arrived as a quiet directive buried in a midweek memo that cited ethical breaches and internal misconduct. There were no headlines, no lawsuits, no dramatic exits, just silence. As if the company had decided to let the dust settle before anyone asked too many questions. But people noticed, and word spread, not just about the audit findings or the forged emails, but about what had really happened, about what I had endured, and, more importantly, how I had endured it. To my surprise, I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was steadiness, like the calm after a long storm, the kind that lets you breathe deeper for the first time in months. I didn't need Derek to fall to feel whole again. I just needed the truth to be seen. A few days later, Martin asked me to meet him privately. I stepped into his office and saw the same folder that had once contained my revised contract sitting closed on his desk. He looked up, his face drawn not with guilt this time, but with reflection. I've had time to think, he said, about everything that's happened, and about what I want this company to become moving forward. I didn't say a word. I wanted him to finish. You've demonstrated more leadership in the last 30 days than most people show in a decade. You protected this company's largest contract, endured a personal attack with restraint, and kept your team grounded in the middle of a storm someone else created. I believe it's time we stop calling that survival and start calling it what it really is, leadership. He pushed the folder toward me. Inside was a new letter, a promotion, Director of Client Strategy, Executive Tier, reporting directly to Martin. I looked up, surprised. I hadn't asked for this. I never lobbied, never campaigned, never even considered what I might want next. All I ever wanted was to be recognized for what I already gave. Martin seemed to anticipate my hesitation. You earned this, he said quietly. Not because of titles or tenure, but because of the kind of leader you already are. I nodded slowly, then placed my hand on the folder but didn't open it again. If I take this, I said, I want more than a nameplate and a new chair. I want a say in how we move forward. I want a culture that protects integrity, not just the bottom line. I want systems that make retaliation harder and truth easier to reach. And I want to rebuild this place for people who don't have the strength or the years to fight the way I had to. He smiled, not out of politeness, but relief. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. And so I stepped into my new role not as a reward for what I'd survived, but as a responsibility to make sure no one else would have to survive it alone. In the months that followed, I got to work quietly, methodically. I reopened doors that had long been shut, revived internal review channels that had been reduced to formality, and introduced an anonymous reporting system that gave every employee, regardless of title or tenure, a voice they could trust would be heard. I reconnected with colleagues who had once left without goodbyes, many of whom confessed they had felt the same pressure, the same isolation, the same fading relevance I had once lived through in silence. And to the younger staff, those just beginning to learn the unspoken rules of corporate survival, I offered not advice, but presence, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can give others is the proof that endurance doesn't have to look like resignation. As for Derek, last I heard, he was interviewing with smaller firms out of state, his name now followed by a cloud of confidential separation and pending inquiries. Some whispered that Martin had pulled strings to keep his son's record clean out of a final act of paternal grace. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Because this story was never about revenge in the way most people define it. It wasn't about destroying someone, it was about refusing to be destroyed. It was about standing back up, not with bitterness, but with backbone. It was about showing that age, illness, and scars, whether visible or not, don't define your worth unless you let them. And I didn't. One afternoon, I passed by the same boardroom where the Reinbrucker deal had nearly crumbled. I paused outside the glass wall and let the memory return not as a wound, but as a reminder. That room had changed everything. But in truth, the real shift had happened days earlier, when I stood in front of Derek after being fired and smiled, not because I was okay, but because I knew who I was. That was the turning point. Not the contract, not the promotion, the moment I refused to beg. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible, discarded, or underestimated, know this. Your worth doesn't expire just because someone else can't see it. Subscribe for more real, raw, and redemptive stories like this. Tazio. Hit the bell icon to never miss a comeback. Ja. And if you've ever been pushed aside but kept standing anyway, your story matters too. Let's make sure the world hears it.